Okay, I think we'll go ahead and get started for the evening. Welcome everyone to this virtual event hosted by Seattle University's Center for Business Ethics. I'm Jeffrey Smith, the director of the Center for Business Ethics, and I also sit in the Frank Schranz Chair of Professional Ethics in the Albers School of Business and Economics. And I want to welcome everyone today and underscore how lucky we are to have everyone in attendance tonight, especially those who might be joining us over on the YouTube live stream. Today's discussion concerns social media and social responsibility, market polarization, an upcoming presidential election with continued signals of foreign election interference, misinformation, COVID-19, mainstream conspiracy theories, civil protests and unrest related to racial injustice. These are just, of course, just a few of the things that are sort of once in a lifetime events that are all converging at once. And large amounts of what we know and learn and understand about these events have been filtered through the medium of social media. And social media, to its critics, arguably is one large sort of behavioral experiment where companies identify, capture, sell, and analyze data about individuals' identity, and subsequently perfect information we digest. The commercialization of this data is one thing, but when social media companies act as the de facto gatekeeper for the information we see, the political ads that are presented to us, the networks that are suggested to us, the interpersonal relationships that are formed, it underscores the powerful influence that social media has come to have in the current media landscape. Social media is a reflection of the larger trends in media, but also, for better or worse, a reflection of how we consume and engage with information. And our free-flowing discussion tonight will explore a number of issues related to the responsibilities that different actors have in the social media landscape. We'll be exploring issues related to trust, truth, misinformation, and free expression. This event was originally scheduled to take place last spring, and it was a keynote event as part of a program that we run at the Center for Business Ethics called Albers Ethics Week, which brings dozens of people from industry into the classroom to talk to our students in the Albers School of Business and Economics about ethical issues across different industries. We usually have a number of keynote events that this was a part of. At the time, we thought it was very topical and timely to have a discussion on the ethical dimensions of social media, and arguably it's even more present now and pressing for us to talk about the responsibilities that social media companies have and our relationship with them. Before I introduce our guests tonight, I want to first do a couple of things by point of order and then also offer some thank yous. The first is I would like everyone to remain muted during the conversation tonight. So if you haven't already muted yourself, please do so. You should automatically be muted. There's a chat function within Zoom that is located on the toolbar. It should be at either the bottom or the top of your screen, depending upon where you have it. And in that chat function, you should feel free to write down any questions you have during the entire evening. And what we'll be doing is monitoring that chat function and integrating those questions when we have a Q&A period at the end of tonight's discussion. The other thing I'll recommend is, I think in the upper right-hand corner of Zoom, you can flip to the speaker view, the active speaker view, which will allow you to see each speaker highlighted in the larger screen. And as I mentioned, there are some important thank yous I want to make before I make introductions. The first is to Frank Schranz himself. Frank has been a longtime supporter of the Center for Business Ethics, and his work has shaped the direction of ethics and the study of ethics and social responsibility in the Albers School of Business and Economics. The same is true with the Boeing Company. They have provided specific support over the years for Albers Ethics Week And they've supported Seattle University in so many countless ways, but in particular for Albers Ethics Week. And so we need to thank them. And then finally, I want to thank Brooke Carlisle, the Frank Schrantz Scholar and Graduate Assistant for the Center for Business Ethics. She was instrumental in helping put this program together. And Brooke, are there any other instructions you want to give the audience tonight before we press ahead with introductions?
Thank you. Yeah, thank you so much. That's super sweet. So I'm Brooke, and as Jeffrey said throughout the conversation, if you do have any questions, go ahead and throw it up in that chat. And if you don't feel comfortable having your name attached to the question, you can go ahead and send it to me privately, and I'll put it in the chat for you. For those of you on the YouTube live stream, you can put your questions in the comments section and I'll transfer it over to this area. So to start, if everyone can let us know where you're coming from, so find that chat feature and type where you're coming from. I'm from Tacoma, Washington, so I'll just type Tacoma and hit enter. And so hopefully you are comfortable with that chat section, and I'll pass it back over to you.
Great. Thank you, Brooke, and thanks for your support of the program. And as I said, we have three distinguished experts, Seattle area experts. This is sort of, I told them before, they're sort of doing a sort of grand tour of Seattle institutions, whether it be Town Hall, the City Club, the University of Washington, you name it. They have been to, and they've been talking about these issues. The Seattle Times, many of you have seen them quoted there numerous times, and it's a pleasure to have them here. The first I'd like to introduce is Caitlin Carlson, my colleague in the Department of Communications at Seattle University, where she's an associate professor. Her primary research interests are in media law and policy as they pertain to new media, freedom of expression, women's press freedom, and women's media ownership. She's published in leading academic journals such as Communication Law and Policy, the Journal of Mass Media Ethics, and the Communication Law Review. And her book called Hate Speech will be published this spring by MIT Press. And I should also note, I think those are all the notes in the back of your office there, are your student notes. She takes her students very seriously. She was named Faculty of the Year by the class of 2015 and was selected as Teacher of the Year by the College of Arts and Sciences in 2019. So thank you, Caitlin, for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Great. Second panelist tonight is Hanson Hosein. He is president of HRH Media Group and also the the co-founder of the Communication Leadership Graduate Program at the University of Washington. HRH Media is a media production and communication strategy firm that has worked with organizations such as REI, Microsoft, Tableau, and King County, Washington. As an earlier practitioner of multimedia storytelling, Mr. Hosein was an award-winning journalist with NBC News, MSNBC, and the CBC. As a documentary film director, his Independent America films have been broadcast worldwide. He's been recognized as one of Seattle's most influential by Seattle Magazine, and his book, Storyteller Uprising, Trust and Persuasion in the Digital Age, was ahead of its time in 2011 and explores how multimedia platforms hold the potential to enhance trust through authentic storytelling. There's a lot to unpack there tonight, and we'll get to it.
Thanks for having me, Jeffrey.
Yeah, thank you, Hanson. And finally, Jevin West joins us. He's an associate professor in the Information School at the University of Washington. He co-founded the Data Lab at the UW and now directs the Center for an Informed Public, an initiative founded in 2019 by the McKnight, with McKnight funding from the McKnight Foundation. He's a biologist by training, but he studies how knowledge about scientific fields develops, what he calls the science of science, and now spends a great deal of time studying the spread of misinformation, especially about science. He teaches courses on data science, machine learning, information ethics, and recently published a book called Calling Bullshit, The Art of Skepticism in a Data-Driven World, which reflects his work on an extremely popular course that's taught at the University of Washington. And thank you, Jevin, because I actually got to say the word bullshit in an academic setting for the first time.
Well, I'm always worried because on the radio, they say if I say it, they'll get charged a fine of $100,000. So I'm glad we're okay here tonight,
Okay.
or whatever the fine is.
Yeah, whatever the fine is. But we can move to BS. But in any case,
Yes.
this is a distinguished panel, and I want to welcome them. But I also want to sort of kick things off by taking about one of the categories of tonight's conversation is misinformation, disinformation, sort of the search for truth, and how we're sort of confronted with problems around that. And I want to turn first to Dr. West. We hear that truth has sort of become a casualty of our civic discourse and how we're living in a post-truth world. And a lot of this is tied to the prevalence of mis and disinformation. And I know you at the Center for the Informed Public has spent a lot of time in disentangling all of the strands that are involved with those phenomena. And I'm wondering if you could maybe start us out by talking about how you at the center think about those terms, misinformation, disinformation, what types and categories you're seeing, and what type of work you're doing in this space.
Yeah, so first of all, thank you, Jeffrey, for putting this on. I wish we could have had it in person and in the spring and in the fall and in the next spring, because it's a really important topic. And thanks for everyone for showing up tonight, and hopefully we'll have a good, rich discussion. So in its simplest form, we separate misinformation, disinformation based on intentionality. Of course, intentionality is hard to measure. So when we're talking about disinformation, we are talking about intentional misinformation, where misinformation more broadly can be mistaken information. It can be the kind of information that erodes by like a game of telephone sort of thing. And we see both kinds. But disinformation is the hardest to detect because it's not just one fake news story that we need to identify and debunk and then watch it as it sort of travels through social media or on the internet. It really requires looking at broader narratives, because a lot of disinformation campaigns that we've studied over the last several years, even before we started this center, a lot of the disinformation campaigns have a lot of truthful information. They have tidbits of true information that pull you in. There's parts, a lot of that information leverages existing narratives and existing stories. So it may be something that really doesn't even require debunking, but sort of fits into a lot of these narratives. Something else we find when studying disinformation is that those pushing these kinds of campaigns are found on both sides of polarized issues. So one example that I like to point to, just because it's such a good example, is was a study done by my colleague Kate Starbird, who was looking at the conversations around the Black Lives Movement several years ago. And if you go on Twitter and you look at these at the level of millions of conversations, you can see two major camps, as you kind of would expect. You'd find the individuals that are for or sort of talking positively about Black Lives Movement, and those that are sort of in what they call sort of the Blue Lives Movement conversations. And one of the things that was really telling about these disinformation campaigns was when Twitter released accounts from what are known Russian accounts that were influencing and having impact on a lot of the kinds of misinformation, disinformation that we're seeing. She found them almost equally in both those conversations. It wasn't that they had chosen an issue; it's that they had sort of put themselves, sometimes the same exact accounts, and were just fomenting conversations and creating divisions. So as you can see, it's very complex. It's hard to track. Those that are pushing these campaigns are quite adaptive, and are really adaptive right now during the election. If we have more time, we can talk about some of the things that we're seeing in this current election with these campaigns. But the big difference, of course, is the intentionality. Hard to measure, hard to detect, but we certainly know it's out there.
Great. And so one sort of follow-up to that, since our focus tonight is on social media in particular, is there a sort of a special, I guess there's sort of a chicken and an egg kind of question here, right? I mean, misinformation and strategic uses of disinformation have existed for a long time before social media. And yet I think there's a sense in which social media has somehow either changed the game or made it worse or somehow is a unique contributor to this problem that we're facing? Or is that actually the case? Or is it simply that it makes it easier to do what has already always existed in terms of our attempts at mis and disinformation?
Well, you're totally right. It's always existed. But I would argue that it's at a level and an intensity that we haven't seen in human history. Through all transitions of information technology, there's always a level of anxiety and a set of learning that society has to go through. There was certainly anxiety when the printing press came along. There was all sorts of writings at the time that people wrote and said, oh, I can't believe anyone can buy a book now. Anyone can write a book. The excrement that's going to come from this kind of writing, the world's going to hell in a handbasket. But we survived that, and I think we'll survive this one. But we certainly have a lot of learning to do. But certainly, social media is contributing, and I like how you phrase it. There is a kind of a chicken and egg. I mean, it sort of has created an environment what makes it worse, but also that misinformation was there and it was just now being amplified. The difference nowadays is that social media allows us all to be editors, both in the creation of our content and the spreading of that content. And there are professionals out there, I call them professional conspiracy theorists that know how to strategically amplify ideas and tweets and Facebook posts online. There are bots, of course, involved, although bots are actually quite hard to detect. There's lots of stories I'm reading more and more in the news about this many bots out there, but we've done a bunch of studies in our center and it's hard to detect them, but we do know they're out there. So you have these automated ways to amplify things. There's these algorithms that are really gluing our eyeballs and are really great at doing that. And if we want, we can have a really altered view of society or of the world if we want that, based on how these algorithms are doing everything they can to keep us onto that platform. So as a researcher, one of the most difficult things to get at is causality. So your question, if you said, Jevin, is social media causing this misinformation crisis? I would say yes, but very hard to substantiate because getting at causality is really difficult. But just from my own experience studying this kind of stuff for years, day and night, social media is clearly playing a role. And if you want to run a little experiment yourself, if you've never done it, try putting an ad on Facebook and look at the level of control that you have when you put those ads. Do the same thing on Twitter. Do the same thing on Google. When you look at the level of control that you have in delivering messages, paid messages and messages as an influencer, you get a sense of the ability to really get your message out there. And people have good reason to do that. So there's a really, we could have an hour conversation just about this question, but I'd say overall, yes, social media is certainly contributing.
Yeah, Jeffrey, if I can chime in too, just from a media studies perspective, I think if folks are looking for kind of a genesis or a starting point, one of the things I always point to is the polarization of media is then when that is kind of transformed on a social media platform. So if we think about like when I was a kid, so I just turned 40, when I was a kid, we had 3 stations, right, for getting news. And then as we see cable news come out, we obviously now have stations that are dedicated to particular parties. And so I think cable news, I think, plays another kind of important role in feeding this machine that now social media is a part of. There's a great book out, what is it called? Networked Propaganda. It's by, I forget the guy's name, but he's a Harvard attorney. And basically what he did was kind of like some of the work Jevin does, where they took 55,000 stories about mail-in voter fraud from March to August and kind of mapped them out and saw that half of the spread is kind of because of social media, but then we're seeing it repeated on places like Fox News. And so it just kind of feeds this ecosystem of mis and disinformation.
I think it's a really good point that Caitlin's saying, and I'll just jump one last thing and then I'll be quiet. The one thing that we've been talking a lot about recently are some of the policies around this, and the fairness doctrine that was sort of eliminated during the Reagan years sort of really, I think, probably led a lot to the polarization that we're seeing in the cable news issue that Caitlin said. And we just recently did a study that we published that got published in Washington Post that looked at the permeability between social media and these cable news networks. And we took one specific example of how an individual who was very obscure, had 2,000 followers on Twitter, was amplified to like, you know, tens of thousands within days, followers, by things that were happening, by what was being reported on Fox News. And then that fed back into social media, that got amplified, more influence, and it sort of was this feedback mechanism.
Yeah, and just for folks who are watching who may not know what the fairness doctrine is, so this was a policy that essentially said that news organizations had to give not necessarily equal time, but shared time to both sides of an issue. And it didn't have to necessarily be during the same episode, right? If 60 Minutes was covering a anti-gun angle on a story about school shootings, eventually, maybe later in that season, they'd have to come back and talk about kind of the other side of the coin. And what's interesting, at least to me, is the fact that, you know, this law was challenged back in the late 60s in a case called Red Lion Broadcasting, and the Supreme Court upheld it. So the Supreme Court has already looked at this and said, you know, fairness doctrine is not something that we would consider a violation of broadcasters' First Amendment rights. And so as we get into talking about freedom of expression, it's really interesting to think about, you know, what kinds of regulations have existed in the past and what might be possible as we look at kind of potential regulations, if that's the way to go for social media.
And since I'm the old timer in the group, clearly now that I know your age, Caitlin, I know how old Jevin is, and the old TV guy, I think I'll sound off on this as well. And I think this pun might lead Jeffrey to where you were going to ask your next question. Yeah. But this is the thing, is that it's very easy to say, yeah, social media is to blame, and there may be indeed some causality here. But the fact of the matter is that actually that is exactly the point where things began to fall apart, when Ronald Reagan did away with the fairness doctrine, because that opened the door to the corporatization of media in a big way in the United States. And yes, cable news and everything else, but it also began to actually create that level of distrust that has only gotten worse over the last 3 decades. And so whatever mistrust we're seeing in misinformation and disinformation campaigns now, you have to ask yourself why that's happening. And it's been happening for decades, even before the internet became a critical mass. And if I had to put my finger on when it started, it's when the fairness doctrine went away and people began to actually wonder who was pulling the levers on essentially news and journalism. And it was that elite group of gatekeepers that we had trusted in the past as we were trying to figure out all these, where media was going. But then we began to see their motivations were a little different as they became beholden to shareholders. And so in the early days of social media, where I was there, we were actually gratified that there was a new democratization of media happening that was going to overturn the old school money changers tables so that we could actually hear and see differently from just that small group. The problem is, it's like that Who song, meet the new boss, same as the old boss. By 2012, when Facebook goes public, these new media players are just as beholden to their shareholders and to money as the old ones. And all they care about is getting as many people on their platforms as possible, which means that if somebody wants to tune into hate speech on YouTube or whatever else, they're not going to get in your way. If the algorithms want to throw them more of that content, so be it. And so they just threw more fire on, more wood onto the fire and fanned the flames of what already was a nascent problem, and social media exacerbated or amplified, to use Jevin's terminology.
So you're right. You anticipated one of the questions I was going to ask you, Hanson, and because you have a little bit more of a perspective on the sort of trajectory of what it means to be a sort of media practitioner, if that's the right word, over an extended period of time. It's always occurred to me that there's a lot of sort of fundamental similarities between the problems that you might get on, say, cable news, where there's this sort of confrontation between views that always needs to be highlighted, and this sort of questioning of the veracity of different players who might be invited into cable news platforms, and the idea that you always need to highlight a controversy, or you need to highlight tension, or you need to highlight how there's distrust between two opposing views. And it seems like there's a line to be drawn between what cable news, I think of as one of the characteristic problems of cable news in that model of journalism, if you want to call it that, and what we see sort of on a real organic level within social media.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just respond to that quickly. I mean, you can draw a line to a certain degree in terms of the kind of discourse that happens in the cable news that we know now and social media. And we're hearkening back to the days of the 3 channels and Walter Cronkite and the voice of God. But that was the aberration, frankly, in the history of journalism in America. Journalism prior to broadcast media in the 40s and 50s, and maybe the apogee, which was the Watergate investigations, was very much like what we see in cable news and Fox and MSNBC now. Joseph Pulitzer, who's got an amazing prize named after him, and I went to the Columbia University School of Journalism that he founded, was a archetypal yellow journalist, as they say back in the time, which was very much in the vein of Fox and MSNBC. And so you could make the argument that journalism, so this bare knuckle journalism that we're seeing now on the cable news networks, is actually part of the American tradition to a certain degree. The difference between that and social media, though, is that that's still controlled by a certain number of editors and producers. Social media, and even as we think about the printing press being a part of that continuum, the fundamental difference is that social media is scaled so huge, and it is two-way, not one-way anymore, that you have to begin to ask yourselves, were we ever meant as a species to be this connected to each other, where we don't even know what the rules of engagement are anymore? I like to say that maybe the Great Library of Alexandria was meant to burn, that we're not supposed to have that much access to that much knowledge because we don't know how to control ourselves. And so I think as we look to the future and what has to happen next, people are sort of saying, shut down hate speech, throw an AI algorithm at it, where the cure might be worse than the illness. So I think social media is its own challenge, as much as we want to tie it to what we've seen in cable news.
Great.
Yeah, I would also just real quick jump into that, just for our audience to keep in mind that, in the United States, like Hanson is saying, we've always had a commercially funded media system. And so because we are looking for advertisers to essentially subsidize our media, right, there's always been and will continue to be this concern about, I need to get eyeballs, whether that's right for these newspapers or broadsheets back in the day, or for social media. It really is about, how can I attract an audience so that I can then sell them to advertisers? And so I guess one of the seeds I would probably plant at this point is to think about, what is different in some other countries where they've got a stronger foundation of public media, to at least counterbalance some of this kind of sensationalism that we see across the board, cable news, social media, right? Like, as we even get to talking about social media ethics, really what, kind of what Hanson's saying, what do we expect these for-profit, publicly traded companies to do other than trying to make money? So just again, a little food for thought for the audience.
Well, and I'll just want to add one thing based on what Caitlin and Hanson said. What social media has done for me is made me really rethink Fermi's paradox. So Fermi's paradox is this paradox that physicists have been talking about for a long time. On one hand, there's this high probability of finding intelligent organisms in the universe because there's a gazillion stars and planets. And the explanation is, but that we haven't seen intelligent or civilizations yet. So the explanation for it was, well, these civilizations probably discovered nuclear weapons or something that destroyed them. It probably was now that they discovered social media, and that's why we haven't seen intelligent organisms around the country.
Yeah. So I actually wanted to sort of turn back to this. That's an interesting set of comparisons and contrasts with media before social media and what we have now. I want to turn back to the question of mis and disinformation real quickly, because in the last 4 to 6 months, there's been a lot of movement on social media platforms in trying to respond to the problem, whether that be in terms of making decisions about the nature and content of political advertising, or whether that be flagging posts or tweets by our president, or whether it be sort of trying to sort of burrow down and filter other forms of mis and disinformation that's sort of promulgated on social media platforms. And I want to turn to Caitlin first. Have places like Twitter and Facebook, in their efforts to combat and respond to mis and disinformation, have their technological and organizational efforts, are they promising? Do they bode well for the future? Is there anything about them that you find problematic or objectionable or overly limiting?
Yeah, so I think one of the things I always try and keep in mind is like, I do genuinely believe these are good faith actors, right? Like I have friends that work at Facebook, that people are genuinely trying to do the best they can with the resources that they have available. That said, I think, you know, they're dealing with a tidal wave of mis and disinformation. And at this point have like, I don't know, like a thimble to kind of bail themselves out of this wave that's coming at them. I think one of the issues that I find troubling is the extent to which companies like, and Facebook in particular, are really blown by the winds of public opinion. So we saw this with the QAnon discourse that got taken, you know, it gets attention, it gets media attention. Facebook says, oh gosh, we got to do something about this. And then they address it. And so, you know, the ease with which they can address it when they want to is concerning to me, to say, well, why didn't you do this before? And I see that a lot with hate speech as well. You know, I also love to look at what they're doing, what these companies are doing in other countries, right? These are global corporations. And so when companies like Facebook want to have a presence in places that have tried to combat mis and disinformation with regulations, they are able to step up to the plate. So in Germany, there was a law passed in 2017 called NetzDG. It's aimed primarily at illegal information on social media companies. Hate speech is one of the things it's aimed at taking down, but it's also meant to address, you know, misinformation. And, you know, in response to this law, Facebook hires a bunch of content moderators, ups their algorithm game, right? Like they're doing all these things. And it's like, well, why didn't you do this before? Why don't you do this here? You know, improve your reporting mechanism, have these transparency reports, right? It's one of these things where it's like, gosh, when I see what you can do, it raises all these questions about what you don't do until you're forced to. And that goes back to, I think, kind of our earlier conversation about as for-profit publicly traded companies, right? What do we expect them to do other than to try and maximize that engagement?
Yeah, and if you want to give them the benefit of the doubt, and I have students who work at Facebook and all these other, and I hear from them, and you could either say it's this whack-a-mole and they're making it up as they go along, which is giving them the benefit of the doubt, or you can sort of say, Facebook has never actually put itself out there as a media organization, because that's very dangerous for them, because then they have to actually play a very active role in regulating the content, and they don't want to do that. They just say they've always said that they're a utility, right? And so they're not going to do anything until somebody makes them do something. There was even a full page ad, I think, in the Wall Street Journal or some newspaper in the last few days, where Facebook is basically saying, regulate us, because they just won't do the right thing unless they're forced to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting about that too, just because over the last year or so, they've hired 15,000 fact checkers. Sounds like a huge number, but the scale of the problem, it's like, I love Caitlin's thimble, like cleaning up an entire dump with a thimble or something, or a toothpick or whatever. I think that's what they're dealing with. What's interesting is that the current regulation that is being most discussed, things like the Communication Decency Act, Section 230, is one of those rare bipartisan efforts, but they're coming at it for different reasons. So, you know, Democrats and Biden himself has said, hey, we want to revoke Section 230. This is this policy that basically is given immunity to platforms based on whatever content is thrown on their platform. So if I post something that's offensive or against the rule or offends you, Jeffrey, then you would have to come after me, not Facebook. But so Democrats are saying, no, we need to take this away. We want them to not be immune to this, so they'll be more careful at the content that goes on. Republicans, on the other hand, or at least coming from the Trump administration, there's even huge viral hashtags on 230 now. The number 230, it's kind of exploding and trending right now. They want to remove it because part of Section 230 is also about allowing platforms to remove information that they find damaging or dangerous, et cetera. So Section 230 has both those things, and both parties are coming at it together. So that's one example that may happen. But I do think one of the things where they need to be doing a better job, at least based on some recent policy work that we've done, is to come up with more specific policies. That helps them. So during the pandemic, it's one of the few times where it showed they could do something. Like Caitlin said and Hanson said, they have this ability to do it. They just that like this full page ad. They really just need to be pushed. They can do it, but they don't have very specific policies, and they certainly don't around election integrity or delegitimization efforts. But they've now started to respond to that just in the last couple of days. So they can do these things, but they're playing catch up on everything and instead of being proactive.
Mm-hmm. Right.
It's a hard problem though.
Yeah. So I was going to ask a variant of that same question, Jevin, to you, which had to do more with sort of mis and disinformation regarding things related to COVID-19 in particular. I'm assuming the Center for the Informed Public has maybe engaged that issue. Have social media platforms done a particularly good or bad job at dealing with the misinformation that has been swirling around things like, information about vaccine development or information about preventative measures or the effectiveness of masks or anything that we now know we hear about every day?
Yeah, so certainly the policies that they put in place are not perfect, but they're one of the few examples where they've been able to be proactive and be consistent a little bit more. So there have, of course, been lots of misinformation around COVID-19, whether it's, a conspiracy theory about the origins of this novel coronavirus, or it could be about treatments or ways to detect whether you have it. And they have been taking things down consistently. And some of the platforms have actually maybe even gone too far, possibly. YouTube, for example, took down a press release video of a couple of Bakersfield doctors were claiming that the IFR, the infection fatality rate, was much lower in California based on test results they had. Now, it was a big mistake. It was a sort of selection bias 101 mistake that we talk about in the center in our class. And that's an example where, yes, it did break their policy, broke their rules, and they took it down. But what it did do is then it fed the narrative even further that there was this control in the media. And that's an example where people could look at the flaw in the argument. But again, it's a hard thing. And so when we look at the misinformation and disinformation around the election right now and around the pandemic, it's the inconsistencies, and it's even when they have policies. So just something we've discovered a couple weeks ago, we've been running experiments where we look at ads based on certain search terms like COVID-19 or the misspelling of coronavirus or a good spelling of coronavirus, and like ballot harvesting or whatever, and doing these searches around the country in small rural areas and urban areas. And we have found that there have been ads put up and top 10 search results that have been highly misleading. And when we've told Google, they've actually taken it down to their credit. But it shows that even when you have a policy, they haven't been able to implement some of their policies either. So on one hand, I'm highly critical. On the other hand, it is a really hard problem. I don't think it's a simple solution. And I do think there are good people at these places, like Caitlin says. I know many of them too, and I have students there. But they play such an important role in society that we kind of have to we need to bring them to the table and force them to talk more about this with society.
Yeah, and Hanson, as a journalist, as someone who's immersed in media on all sorts of levels, what's your reaction to the response that you're seeing from the social media companies and firms with regard to the preservation of truth and clamping down on
I call it benign neglect. And I think they have a pattern of benign neglect. I mean, I don't think they have any malevolent intentions, but by not paying attention to essentially this radioactive property they've unleashed upon all of us and looked at its impact, it actually has a very negative consequences on society. And so, on one hand, yeah, we do need them to regulate, but they also know that the stuff that sells best, the things that get most traction on their platforms, tend to be the falsehoods, tend to be the propaganda. And so they're carefully balancing their business model with what they know to be right. And so I think Jevin, and the last thing he just said, is probably where the truth lies in terms of doing something about this. These companies, they really are muddling their way through this. Their employees know that they're kind of on the wrong side of history right now, and they really want to do something about it, but they can only do so much. And so we need to actually create fora for these people to come together and sort of almost like a people's assembly of tech workers and journalists and citizens to sort of say, hey, if the regulators can't do anything about this, we need to counterbalance that power. Those are like monarchies. Facebook is a nation into itself in terms of its reach and power, and there's no accountability. How do we create that accountability so that it's almost like a people's assembly on the monarchy before the guillotines come out?
Mm-hmm. Right, right. So one of the things that I think we're all wrestling with when it comes to, a lot of us use social media, a lot of us are trying to refrain from using social media. On Tuesday, we had a presentation as part of this Albert's Ethics Week series, where one of the obligations one might say we have as individuals is to be careful about how we share things, how we consume things, how we, as it were, become a cog in the wheel of social media. And a lot of what you all are pointing to is the fact that it's sort of an interesting sort of regulatory self-restraint on the part of the firms, active involvement by the firms, making sure that we know that we educate individual users. It's a really complicated response that we need. I want to ask Caitlin one question about hate speech, because I know that's your specialization, before I sort of broaden things out. You have a book forthcoming, but a lot of the ways in which, especially I would say those on the right of the political spectrum, have responded to the steps taken by social media companies, right, is to sort of invoke and claim that their rights of expression are sort of being infringed upon. And I'm wondering what's your take on that kind of problem that's being raised, and is it a problem? And if it is a problem, to what extent is it a problem?
Well, I mean, it makes for a great talking point for political parties, but really we have no freedom of expression or First Amendment rights on social media. So, when you click the little I agree box and say, yes, I agree to your terms of service for the privilege of logging on to Facebook or Twitter or Snapchat or whatever it is, those go out the window. And really, honestly, the First Amendment is about government restrictions on speech, not about corporate restrictions on speech. So even when we think about, hate speech is allowed in the United States, unless it crosses into like a true threat or incitement or something like that, social media companies aren't bound to uphold the First Amendment. And so that's why you see them they could make whatever rules they wanted to. They could say no red text and we can't use red text. I mean, whatever they decide to do, they could do. And so I think there's a lot of misunderstanding with the public about what your freedom of expression actually entails. I think, when we see Trump at one point did a executive order about some of the conservative bias potentially on social media. And, there is research. There was a study that looked at various Facebook pages and the level of civility. And it did show that there was less civility on these conservative pages. And honestly, Twitter has there's Twitter executives that have talked to journalists about this idea that if we were to really, because some journalist was asking, why is Twitter so good when it comes to taking off any propaganda having to do with Islamic terrorism? Gone, no problem. Try and find it on Twitter. But when it comes to domestic terrorism and white pride websites, Proud Boys, all this stuff we're seeing now, you don't see the level of removal. And Twitter execs have been on the record saying, well, because if we did that, it would end up addressing or taking information down from Republican pages. So I do think on some level there is a greater amount of that content in these places. And so when it feels to conservatives like, they're coming after me or they're taking it down, it's because that stuff lives there. And it goes back to some of the things I think we were saying earlier about, Hanson, I love what you said about this balancing act between their business model, right? Making money and doing what they know to be right. I think there is some acceptance on the part of these social media companies to tolerate a certain amount of extremism in order to maintain a level of engagement. Facebook users tend to be more conservative. And so it's no surprise that there is, the amount of hate speech or incivility that we see on those pages.
Yeah, Caitlin, you raise a good point in terms of, I think, especially when you look domestically when it comes to social media, these companies are sensitive about offending Americans from a political point of view in terms of taking those actions. And if you even look at the congressional report, when they called some of these companies to the mat a few weeks ago, it's very interesting to see the bifurcation in terms of what Democrats care about, Republicans care about. Republicans think that these companies are abusing their power by squelching conservative opinion on these platforms, which I don't believe is necessarily true, but for what reasons you say. And then the Democrats are worried about an abuse of power. And so both of them want to regulate these companies, but for very different reasons. And neither is actually entirely appropriate for what really has to happen, but it's all through the lens of politics right now.
Well, and sometimes I worry, when we get into the weeds about what's happening on this side and what's happening on that side, sometimes it feels like we're ignoring some of the underlying issues, right? So when we talk about dis and misinformation around voting, to me, that feels like a new poll tax, right? This is racism, is really what it is, or it's social inequity is really what it is that's driving, is the driving force behind some of these groups using the tools available to them to achieve these same ends. So when I hear politicians, again, going into the weeds about here's what we should do, right? There was a great quote on Twitter. I'm not going to remember who said it, but it basically said, you know how that saying that's like, you're bringing a knife to a gunfight. Well, basically the person said, it's like you're bringing fact checking to a culture war, right? Like we have these deep, deep divisions. So getting too far in the weeds about, well, let's do it this way or let's do it that way is a nice skirt around. Well, let's address inequality, or let's address the real systemic racism that does exist in this country.
That comment reminds me of something I've heard Jevin say on a few different occasions, which is the sort of psychic and cognitive energy that has to go into responding to disinformation and or even hate speech, or even speech that doesn't sort of productively steer us towards the truth, is such an endeavor. It's really quite a burden on those who are sort of fighting against the tide of that, right?
Yeah, it's a Sisyphean task, of course, that we're always just again after again and again. You're just like going up and down the mountain with the rock and doing it again and again. One thing I would just add, just to the last 2 points that Hanson and Caitlin were talking about, is it will be interesting to see the role that Parler and Gab play. These are two alternative social media platforms to Twitter, partly in response to some of these restrictions, and partly a place for a lot of the people on the right to have their conversations. We've been studying it to some degree and watching what's happening there. You find some really interesting things. One thing, for example, when you start an account, they say, oh, do you want to follow Ted Cruz and this person, this person? It's all from the right. And there's much looser restrictions. So you see a lot of the hate speech and things on Parler and Gab. But if we already are kind of in our separate worlds. I mean, the political world in separate worlds. And now if we have separate platforms, we don't even live on the same platforms anymore, then we could speculate about what's happening after that. At this point, there's only about 2.5, 3 million people or so on Parler, but I think that's an interesting development over the last year or so that we should be on the lookout for.
Interesting. So, we're at 20 minutes past 6, and I want to make sure we leave time for some Q&A from the other participants. So again, I'll remind everyone who's participating in the call to drop any questions you have in the chat box. But since I have 3 people here who, as I said before, have sort of made their way through various discussions and institutions in the Pacific Northwest, as people who've been in conversation with policymakers, legislators, with other business leaders in the area, given the current state of not just social media and the way that social media is used, but the current state of media writ large, and also the sort of state of our civic discourse in the midst of all of the troubles that we're facing, what's the most pressing issue that you're worried about? What keeps you up at night? What drives you to sort of think more critically about some of these issues?
That it may be too late, that we have gone way past the point of no return because of the power and fragmentation these platforms have unleashed. something that Caitlin asked earlier was about whether America, given its lack of sort of consensus media, unlike other countries, is different, and the answer is no. And I was born in London, as you can tell from my accent. I interned at the BBC. I worked for the CBC, and I grew up in Canada. And both, maybe they have tighter social contracts, and they are social welfare countries where they have better healthcare and they take care of each other well. But hate speech exists in both of those countries. Fragmentation exists in both those countries. Social media is upsetting the cart in both of those countries and around the world. And so the power disequilibrium right now in terms of what's going on is universal, and it's really wreaking havoc. And so rather than trying to address it at the platform level and even the regulation level, we really do have to ask ourselves, why is this happening in the first place? And I look at it from a 60,000 foot altitude and sort of say, well, the institutions that we've established our society on are completely irrelevant or losing relevance, and therefore we can diss them and mistrust them along the way. And we have to come up with new stories and new social infrastructure and a new social contract that is relevant, that addresses our major challenges that these previous institutions just can't. And so what are we going to do about that to fix it at a very systemic level, which I think both Jevin and Caitlin raised earlier?
Mm-hmm.
I think for me, the biggest concern I have is simply the annihilation of the idea of truth or fact. When we talk about this to students, to the public, to anyone who's willing to listen about this issue of misinformation, disinformation, it concerns me every single time that people will leave the discussion and have even less trust in this system that we depend on. In democracy, we depend on trust in these institutions. And I know Hanson's written about this and talks really eloquently about the role that trust plays in all of this. And so I think what we need to do is, of course, address it. We need to talk about it. We need to improve media literacy in K1 through K99. We have lots to do right now to address these issues, but we need to always, kind of remind all of us that, despite some of these issues going on, even institutions like science that are being attacked, despite these issues that we're having, it still works and can work as long as there is trust in the system. And so what really does scare me right now, and I think it does for a lot of people, is a lot of the delegitimization of the institution of voting too. I think that's one of those examples. And one of the things I've learned from this postdoc that we hired, and I was telling Hanson this the other day, is that there's a concept of conservation of mass that physicists talk about all the time, that you can't create or delete mass, that it sort of just transfers. And that's similar to trust too. So if we completely annihilate trust in, say, the mainstream media or in any institutions more generally, and that's something that we're seeing. It's actually it's the main objective of a lot of these disinformation campaigns. If you read the literature all the way back into the 70s about this, it's about eroding trust. And so if you erode that trust, it doesn't just, on that institution, it doesn't just go away, it just goes to somewhere else. People need that trust. And so it goes to these fringes in the internet. It goes only to your nearest neighbor. And if you only can trust your nearest neighbor, your neighbor doesn't know all that much. And so I think it's that trust. It's the annihilation of the idea of truth and facts, and it's that erosion in trust in these institutions that we depend on.
Yeah, I would echo what Hanson and Jevin have just said. I saw this clip on CNN, and I swear I thought it was like a Daily Show clip. I couldn't believe that it was on CNN, where this reporter was going around at a rally for President Trump, and he was showing people deep fakes that they had liked on, they were talking about what's on your Facebook, and they were showing them these manipulated videos, and they were telling them, well, this video is manipulated. Let me show you the original and show you the manipulated one. And the people without fail were like, it's a good laugh. I don't care. Right. Like this disdain for people mention public institutions, but for me, the institution of journalism is really, I think, nerve-wracking. In legal scholarship, people talk about what's called the marketplace of ideas, this idea that, ideas should come together and battle it out and the truth will emerge. And I think now with disinformation and just the volume of information that social media has unleashed, truth is not emerging, right? Climate change is a perfect example of, ideas battle it out and science loses, right? Or COVID, we see this same thing. And so even when we talk about, I agree, you know, and Washington has actually got a bill in the Senate right now to fund more media literacy, digital literacy in K through 12. And I think that is very valuable. But when you get people, you know, even if they have that ability to discern what's right and wrong, they just, the truth can't make that next step, or it can't become the thing we base policy off of. The other thing that really worries me is that we will try to, you know, we're backed into a corner and we'll try and regulate our way out. And we've already seen, so there is, we mentioned Section 230 earlier. There's been one effort to kind of nip around the edges, and that's this FOSTA SESTA, you know, rules that are basically designed to limit sex trafficking using social media platforms. So if 230 makes it so that Facebook can't be liable for what third parties do on the site, FOSTA SESTA kind of changes that around this one area. And so when we think about the potential to just want to regulate our way out of this, I could see it could be really dangerous in taking away our ability to kind of speak freely and misusing some of these regulations as ways to silence political dissent. In 2018, the European Commission did just a massive study about this issue of misinformation, and their conclusion was that, you know, regulating against this is perhaps not the best solution. And so I worry about, we've had, and it's interesting, I think in panels like these, it's so easy to get on, here are all the problems with social media, but as other folks have said, there's a lot of really cool stuff that has come of this. And there have been a lot of really great opportunities for people who did not have a voice or did not have a way to communicate with audiences that now can. And so I would hate us to lose the democratizing opportunity that this technology presents for fear that we can't figure a way through it rather than around it.
That was just so beautifully put. That's all I have to say. Thank you.
Bless you, Hanson. Oh, that's so thank you.
Yeah, sometimes we talk a lot in the business school about how regulations are a sort of large, blunt hammer, right? That can accomplish certain things, but aren't particularly good at accomplishing other things that get sort of interrupted or harmed in the process of trying to regulate out of a problem. And this is just, I think, a really a nice example of that issue. There was a question that's sort of come across the chat that's related to this question of regulation. And so since we're on that topic, maybe I'll raise it. Maybe I'll give Jevin and Hanson an opportunity to chime in here. You know, apart from, we've talked about 203 and its implications, and Caitlin has just sort of warned us against over-regulating or regulating our way out of this problem. But are there any other regulatory moves that Jevin or Hanson you see as possibilities that could help us in this situation?
Well, this is when I look to my legal scholars that we have in our center. Actually, we have 4 pillars in our center: research, education, community engagement, and policy, because there's no way I could do that. So I sort of look to like Ryan Kalo and to others that sort of think a lot about this. But I think just the threat of regulation, even without regulation, has made some of the companies start to be more proactive. You've seen a lot more efforts at removing bots, for example. There was a lot of discussion whether there needed to be some specific policies around bots. You know, one cool paper, speaking of Ryan, who wrote looking at if there were rights, that bots, did they have rights on the internet? And what was interesting is you can work through the argument as to why you'd want to regulate bots, but in the end, if you care about the value of anonymity on the internet, and there's certainly reasons to have anonymity, you would want to be careful even with regulating on the bot. So there's always these different sides of the coin. But I would just say, you know, at this point, just bringing them to the table, I don't think these congressional hearings have been all that effective. It's brought some attention to it. It certainly revealed how little our congressmen and congresswomen know about how tech companies work and the business models. But I think the more that we talk about this, and the more that they're engaging the tech companies themselves, and they see a need for it. And I just find that Wall Street Journal advertisement that Hanson was talking about, showing that they are sort of crying for help. You know, we give them a little bit of empathy, but not much.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think if any regulation is going to happen, I think it's going to be less likely around the content and more, especially depending on the outcome of the election in a few weeks. If there's a Democrat sweep there, the threat is of breaking up these companies, and it's looking at their power consolidation
Right.
as opposed to how they're doing communication and media. And I don't know if that's going to solve anything, because you could break those up. And you know, Jevin was talking about these 2 new platforms that are coming. So people will find other ways to communicate. And the greatest danger is that even like Twitter and Facebook are technically out there and open. But as we go more into these text messaging type platforms where everything's encrypted and you have these small groups that can hide behind that and nobody can see it, then it doesn't matter how much you regulate what's publicly facing, the stuff is still going to happen elsewhere.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, and there has been some discussions recently around moving to subscription models. I mean, they've been talking about that actually for a very long time, but that has problems too. I mean, actually just subscription models in journalism itself is hard because a lot of the best content sits behind paywalls. And that's a lot of the garbage is sitting outside the paywalls. And so there's, I mean, it's, the point is it's really, there's no perfect solution that I have heard of at this point. And yeah, so that's why we need more of these discussions.
Yeah, the one thing I would point to of who has power in this situation is the users. So I was following pretty closely the Stop Hate for Profit campaign, where a bunch of advertisers basically said, you know, until Facebook gets its act together on hate speech, we're not going to advertise. And Casey Newton did this great piece where he looked at the money behind it, and they barely lost a dime. It barely made a dent. But I do think that if and when users en masse were, if they were to, and I don't know that that's a realistic solution. I hate when people say, well, just get off Facebook, get off Twitter. It's like, well, you know, I have all these great conversations. Like Jevin keeps mentioning Ryan. I'm like, I kind of feel like I know him, but I just follow him on Twitter, right? Like, you know, it opens you up to all these new ideas or new people. And so there's some really cool stuff about it. But I do think that the users, if there was a situation where users were able to kind of come together and either move away from platforms that weren't doing a good job of dealing with misinformation towards ones that were, that might be something that perhaps sparked change.
And just to add on to that, because that's a really good point that Caitlin's saying, also if the advertisers themselves, I think that's what Caitlin said, the users and even advertisers, because one interesting thing that happened, you know, a little while ago, a year and a half or so ago, was when General Electric and some of these large companies that care a lot about their brand were found advertising on these really offensive hate speech, these groups that sort of are promulgating hate speech. And they said, we don't want to be there. And then Facebook and some of these other tech companies had to clean things up. And they responded to, they're another kind of user.
Yeah. So there's a question that's been floated in the chat. And maybe this is a question first for Jevin, and then we'll see if the other two panelists have a reaction to it as well. How much of the spread of misinformation is due to sharing, that is individual users sharing information, as opposed to sort of Facebook algorithms that are pushing stories?
Oh, that's an interesting question. I would say, first and foremost, it would likely be sharing, just because when we look at the data that we collect on publicly available social media data, like the Twitter data that we collect, and we have billions of tweets, it's the sharing of legitimate users too. So a lot of people that are strategically designing these campaigns, they sort of take advantage of current content and influencers and users, and it's us who's sharing. So we're doing it. Now, because the Facebook and the Twitter algorithms are sitting in a black box that not even they have the keys to a lot of times, it would be super interesting from my standpoint as a researcher to compare different permutations of those algorithms and downweight some things and upweight other things and see what's sort of leading to amplification. But ultimately, even though these algorithms have huge influence on what we see, and they're constantly changing it. We can do experiments where we can see how often algorithms change based on certain search terms, and they're constantly changing because they're adapting to the content, and they're trying to meet their objective of keeping you on the platform as long as possible. So they're clearly having a role, but it's ultimately us who's sharing it. And so one of the things we say, and maybe we oversay it because it's a little too trite, but it's think more, share less. If we would just share a little bit less, put a little friction in those lines, pause a little bit more, and not share things, then maybe we'd be a little bit better off. But certainly us sharing, and I would love to do that experiment. So it's an interesting question.
Yeah, and to back up Jevin on that, I know somebody fairly high up within one of these social media platforms who's been trying to do something about the spread of misinformation, disinformation, and has found, as they've tested this, that people, he basically said people are addicted to lies. That when he sees something that is untrue go through the system, it is shared 4 to 6 times more or faster down the news feed, as opposed to something they try to push that they know is true. And so it is very much happening at the human level more than the algorithmic, if that is to be believed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. The other morning, or maybe it was this morning, I was reading in the New York Times a piece about how so we're in an environment now where we talk a lot about sort of people believing things that they might not otherwise believe in a different environment. Conspiracy theories becoming more mainstream. QAnon now latching on to what was formerly just a fringe view is now sort of gaining traction among more sort of, I guess, slightly more mainstream groups. The first reaction that a lot of people had to the diagnosis of President Trump having coronavirus was, well, wait a minute. Is that something that might itself not be true? Could this be sort of a ruse or a way in which, for whatever strategic reason you want to impute on that event, it might not actually be the case? And I thought, well, we're swimming in, we're swimming in soup now, where everything becomes conspiratorial, which goes to the earlier point about how if there's a complete breakdown in trust, our willingness to sort of believe the most basic information we're getting over our sort of formerly trusted news sources is sort of going by the wayside. And that seems very troubling, to say the least. I don't know if Jevin or you or Caitlin had any reaction to the coverage of that particular angle of the diagnosis over the weekend.
Well, that was what happened at my house. It was late at night and I was up reading and I'm like, well, I'll check Twitter one more time before I go to sleep, and saw the news and told my husband. And the first thing he said was like, I don't know about that. So I think, we've talked a lot about like erosion of trust in institutions. I mean, again, I'm a First Amendment person. I am somebody who genuinely believes in the value of a free and fair press to a democracy. And so when we have this attack, right, you've got literally people at the highest level saying this is, these are enemy of the people, really undercutting the people that up until now we've relied on to sift through this information. I think there is this tension between, like we've talked about, like, yes, we have a commercially driven media system, but I also think that journalism as an institution is, a group of people who have been trained in this profession, who have ethics, who are genuinely out to get the accurate information and share it. And so, I think sometimes it's hard to separate out, like, what do the people upstairs at, even the Seattle Times, right? The publishers want versus, I do have faith in the journalists on the ground if we gave them the trust that I think they've earned over the years. And Hanson, you may feel totally differently, but I think that's probably one of the biggest issues, because like with this, at this point, who do we turn to say, okay, I trust, like for me, like Maggie Haberman at the New York Times, right? Like I check her Twitter and I think, okay, if she's telling me this is what it is, this is as close as I'm going to get because I trust her individual journalist, which again, one of the cool things about Twitter is that we can connect with these individual journalists and say, okay, I think they're giving it to me straight. And so, when we look for solutions, kind of finding ways to improve and increase the number of journalists, the funding for journalists, there are a lot of countries, I mentioned public media, that do spend, public money on journalism. And is that something we need to look at?
Yeah, I think the fundamental challenge here is that journalism in America has been a sacred institution from the beginning. It's actually enshrined in the Constitution to a certain degree. But the fact that we can criticize it and demean it to the level that we're seeing it now, I mean, I call it a sacred story. Journalism is a sacred story in the American democratic story, which tells me that the sacred story of American democracy is itself on the ropes. And that if QAnon as a conspiracy theory or whatever else continues to explode like that, I have to ask myself why. And it's because there are certain people who have found so much mistrust in what used to be our shared sacred stories. They found something else that resonates with them much more. It's just like any other religion. And so we either do what we say is sort of throw more resources at this and totally bulk up what we think are the factual sources with the hope that people will have no choice but turn to them, or we say, you know what, the stories that served us until now that support these institutions just don't work anymore. Let's let them go, and let's think about what are these new sacred stories that we can come up with collectively with people who we haven't agreed with for the last 60 years that will allow us to begin to collaborate at scale yet again, which is calling into question the very fundamentals of American democracy. If we can't agree on the facts, how can we have a democracy? Well, how do you fix it? We can throw AI at it. We can do what China's doing. There's no democracy there. So what are we going to do to create a new story around our democracy that more of us can agree around?
Wow. Yeah, I think that's, you know, both Caitlin and Hanson gave a great answer. So I'm not going to be able to add anything other than let's invest in local journalism somehow. If it's a public option, or at least let's talk about it. Because these news deserts in these areas where they don't have local journalism, there's been many studies over the last several years that look at things like when the local paper goes bankrupt and it leaves, you see lower voter turnout, you see less government accountability, et cetera, all these things that are linked to that. And of course, it's not, you know, it's not a panacea, but it's certainly is something that is worth investing in. And by the way, during crisis events, not all rumors are false. Some are true. We want people chattering around sometimes, as long as we sort of, you know, are trained or at least share a common set of norms about how we go about knowing the world. There's something that scholars have been talking about more recently, something called tribal epistemology. And that's this idea that, you know, it's not that information is evaluated based on some conformity of common standards or evidence that correspond to a common understanding world, but rather on whether that piece of information came from my tribe and sort of is good for my tribe. So true and good for our side sort of begin to blur. And that's sort of this world in which we live now. And that's not the sort of epistemology that I sort of subscribed to when I took my first philosophy class. I mean, I would hope that we would sort of deal more in the empirics and come with these final standards. But I do think this thing that Hanson's saying about really having to, you know, look at this sacred story and how it's sort of being sort of put off to the side and into these different worlds, that's stuff where I think that we're seeing too, especially with the rise of groups like QAnon. But of all things, you could shut all that stuff up and just say, let's invest in local journalism, because those people are the people you have coffee with and you can build trust and you can have conversation. So let's figure out how to do that, and then maybe good things will happen.
This former board member of KUOW, our local NPR station, applauds you for saying so.
I'm hearing a really good case for a certain kind of storytelling that's about authenticity, that's grounded in sort of a shared understanding of the world, rather than storytelling that gets sort of divided and tribal in Jevin's terms.
But you have to be brave about that shared understanding and let other people's opinions in that you don't agree with, because if you don't do that, we're going to continue to stay in our corners.
Right. Right.
Yeah, Hanson, I love your call to reimagine what the future might look like, because I think as much as we kind of doom and gloom about, you know, enemy of the people and, you know, newspapers falling apart, I think about, I don't know if y'all have been watching here in Seattle, Omari Salisbury, I think Omar Salisbury is the guy's name. He has been, it's Omari Salisbury. He's been on the front lines of all of the protests. So he's been down at Black Lives Matter. He's been covering, I mean, he's kind of right on the fence between a citizen journalist and a professional journalist, hyper local. And it puts boots on the ground, or it puts eyes on what's actually happening. And so to me, when I see stuff like that, I'm so hopeful. Like I think the technology of us all having cameras, of us all, now I'm not claiming that we all have editorial discernment and should choose what's most important or that sort of thing. But I do think that there's a lot of potential in these technologies, again, like Hanson's saying, to reimagine what journalism and information sharing might look like. The other thing I'll say, and it just reminded me, so some of this stuff, you know, I think also, and I don't know how effective it's going to be, but does having awareness, and Jevin, you might actually have the answer to this, but does having awareness about our own, you know, selective exposure or our own sense of biases, does that help us kind of combat them in terms of media literacy? If we know, okay, I'm always going to go for stuff, right? Selective exposure. I'm going to go for stuff I agree with. It's uncomfortable, right? I don't like having cognitive dissonance where this doesn't fit with me. You know, is that something that's teachable? I don't know. Jevin, do you know?
Well, we've tried in our Misinfo Day, where we bring hundreds of high school students from across Washington and rural and urban areas to campus, and we go through these exercises that deal with confirmation bias. And what I found is, I mean, one, if we can even just make people self-aware of these things, that's good. I don't know of any great studies. I mean, the person I would look to is David Rand at MIT, doing a bunch of cool work on this, and Gordon Pennycook also, that's doing some stuff in this area. But I don't know, it's a good question, but I think at least being self-aware of this bug in our brain software, we don't like that uncomfortable dissonance. We don't like things that go against our narrative, but just being the self-awareness at least would be one step towards it. And even getting there though can be hard, especially with younger students.
Yeah. So we are brushing up against our end time. We're actually a little bit over, and I realize that we have a couple of questions in the chat box that I haven't gotten to yet. I realize some people may need to peel off at this point, but I thought I might ask a couple of those remaining questions, and then we'll sort of tie things up, assuming our panelists can hang out for an extra few minutes. There's a question from Matt. Recently, the New England Journal of Medicine editorial team endorsed not re-electing Trump due to his administration's response to COVID. Some have suggested that the time has come for editors at newspapers and journals to stop endorsing political candidates, given the difficulty that readers have in separating news from opinion. Do you think that this is likely to happen?
Well, I find Matthew's question especially interesting because Scientific American endorsed also in the first time in their 100+ history a candidate. And I think people could make an argument for both sides. I do think I see why it's done. As someone who's been trained as a scientist, and we do everything we can in science to separate politics, certainly from our methodologies. I don't know. I find that a little concerning. I can see a strong argument for why these editors at New England Journal of Medicine and Scientific American have done it, but I feel much more confident or much more comfortable with science, especially science. I can speak about science, keeping these endorsements sort of separate. But you know, I don't know. I'd look to my panelists on their comment on this, and they probably know more about.
I wouldn't comment very specifically about the decision to do so, but I think it's indicative of something larger, where we used to have an unwritten set of rules about decorum in terms of how much we declare our allegiance with a particular party or political figure, because everything was so much aggregated in the middle, right? And so it was okay for us to slightly disagree with somebody else who was from the other party because the degree of difference wasn't that huge. But I think because we are so fractured and we are living in the equivalent of the French Revolution right now, where you've got two opposing sides and the middle is still there, but the middle doesn't have the voice they used to, and nobody really cares about the middle anymore. They want to go where the heat is. And so I think we're beginning to see the breakdown in the traditional etiquette around, you know, declaring allegiances and being public about it. And people are just desperate to do things. And I think that just tells you yet again that the rules around institutionalism in this country are just being thrown out the window.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I would also say, you know, I probably would be in favor of them continuing to do this because I think our notion of objectivity, especially in journalism, is changing substantially. So while in the past journalists were asked to take this really objective kind of middle of the road stance, I think what we're more interested in now, and we see this in like, why is John Oliver or Trevor Noah, why are these political satire shows so popular, is because at least I can trust what you're saying. And so I think we're going to continue to see people gravitate towards particular journalists or news organizations that they feel are providing them with accurate and useful information that's backed up by what they see as factual sources. And so again, it's not going to totally, you know, allow us to escape this problem of disinformation. But I do think when we think about what is it we expect from our journalists in the future, I want to know where you stand. And it's fine for you to tell me where you stand and me to help use that information to figure out where I stand.
That's a brilliant point. I just want to say that the whole notion of objectivity also relates back to that notion of the aberration that we've experienced with journalism for the last 50 or 60 years. Objectivity itself, I believe, is a canard. And so what Caitlin is, the case that Caitlin is making is one that a lot of journalists are talking about right now. Instead of trying to be as fair as possible and balanced, be transparent in terms of how you're doing your work and maybe what your beliefs are. And people will actually trust you more, even if they don't agree with you.
Right. Yeah, sometimes when you go under the rubric of teaching a controversy or providing both sides, when in fact there aren't really both sides, and when you talk about things like maybe global climate change, or I'm thinking of creation scientists wanting to sort of teach the controversy as if there's Jevin's a biologist, right? There really is no controversy there, right? In terms of certain issues, rather it seems like journalists ought to really, as you say, sort of become transparent conduits rather than feeling as if they need to sort of always provide both sides to something. There was one last question about Twitter and the elephant in the room, which is Trump, President Trump. How do we go about navigating this weird space where we want or perhaps encourage or think it's appropriate or not for social media companies to sort of filter the speech of elected officials? Is that, what's the terrain in which we exist there? Is that helpful or not helpful? Is it something that we expect of them? Is it maybe Caitlin, maybe you, maybe this is your space first, and then I see Jevin's willing to jump in on that.
Yeah, so I think, we've talked in the past, several minutes about they don't see themselves as media companies. However, they have an enormous responsibility. If you are going to hand the microphone to someone and let that person access your millions of users, I think you have a certain responsibility, perhaps not to certainly censor that, but to provide additional information that contextualizes what it is we're seeing. So I personally applaud when Twitter, puts a label on, a Trump tweet that says, this is inaccurate, or even in certain cases, takes it down. I mean, I'm somebody who fully supports the First Amendment and freedom of expression, but I question what certain types of expression add to the conversation. If the reason we protect expression, in theory, is so that our democracy can function, I don't know what you calling people looters and thugs is doing to help our democracy. Shut it down. So I'm probably maybe perhaps more in favor than other folks of social media organizations really taking a stand and saying, I always think about it this way. So, what if you owned a farm and the KKK was meeting on your farm? Would you tell them to get off your farm? Right? Or would you continue to allow them and be like, well, what are you going to do? The KKK is here, right? So I think if we kind of think about this in real life and then compare it to what we're seeing on these platforms, you're allowing this sort of thing to happen on your property. And so you at some level are responsible if you don't take measures to counteract it.
Jevin, I'm going to let you have the last word.
Well, and I don't know if this should be the last word. There's all sorts of great comments and questions I'm seeing by those that are still hanging out. So thank you for those people that are still hanging out. Great question. I wish we had more time to go through, and maybe we do. I'll just make one quick point, at least about what these different platforms are doing. What we have found in some of this policy analysis is that there's such variance, even within all of Facebook's companies. So they own Instagram and of course Facebook and other platforms. Even there's variance. One of the things that it looks like the platforms are settling on, at least for government officials, not all of them again, because there's variance across the platforms, is that they will label some of these based on whatever policies they have, but keep them up because of of public record, because they're voices as politicians. But I think this one's going to continue to evolve. So we have this great set of group of students and others that have been tracking these policies and how they're changing. And it's amazing that it's like within days, sometimes there's a change in policy around this. And this particular one's going to be interesting going forward. But at least the sort of place where they've mostly gravitated towards now is like, we'll label it, or if it's a big public official, we'll leave it for public record. And then, you know, if you're not a famous, you know, politician or big influencer, they'll, I think they, you know, some of them will take it down based on if it broke the rules or whatever.
Great. Well, it's unfortunate that we've gone over almost 15 full minutes, and I appreciate everyone sticking around, and I appreciate the panelists engaging in some of the questions. There's a couple that we didn't get to, but I want to make sure I respect the time of our guests, and thank everyone for attending tonight's conversation. Obviously, it's just the beginning in a lot of ways. It's something ongoing. And some really important issues, I think were clarified, but also give us some imperative to think more about. And let me say, I'd be remiss if I didn't follow through on a request made by the president of Seattle University, President Sundborg, Father Sundborg, that everyone needs to be mobilizing themselves around the vote and making sure that they're informing themselves about the process around voting. And if you are set here in Washington State, make sure you're talking with your friends and family and relatives outside of Washington State. Vote.gov is a good conduit through which you can get information on every single state's registration process. If there's anything that we want to take away from tonight, that probably is one important thing to sort of walk away with. I want to thank our guests again. We'll give them a sort of virtual applause. And we'll be posting an edited version of this discussion later on our YouTube site. And thank you all to our three panelists.